Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Both Sides of the Brain. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation and listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will also have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording. And now I'd like to introduce Joe Ridholm, editor of Quirk's Marketing Research Review. Joe?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Both Sides of the Brain, How to Gain a Holistic Understanding of Your Customer's Mind. I'm Joe Ridholm, editor of Quirk's Marketing Research Review. And before we get started, just a few quick notes. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording of the event approximately 24 to 48 hours after we're done here today. And there will be time for questions after the presentation, so feel free to submit questions as we go along, and we'll get to as many of them as we have time for. Our presenter today is Chuck Bean. Chuck leads the Emotion Intelligence Group at the Martech Group. And with that, I will hand things over to Chuck. Take it away, Chuck.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Good day, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending upon where you are. Certainly our pleasure to present this webinar, and we hope that it helps in terms of obtaining a better understanding of what really drives the customer behavior and what motivates customers and how you understand those things. So we really want to focus on the how as we go along. We hope this is very educational, and as Joe said, look forward to questions at the end to further illuminate on these topics. In terms of an agenda, we'll start with a quick overview of the need. Why do we need to look at research holistically? And how does that impact the field of market research and marketing in a broader sense? One of the keys to that is understanding how to get at emotions. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the practice of emotion intelligence and some of the keys and techniques that we found that help obtain a more holistic approach or understanding of the customer's mind. And then we'll finish up with some case studies looking at real-world examples from work that we've completed and how it connects the dots, how it pieces together both sides of the brain to enable clients of ours to see things that they couldn't have seen before and to have that more complete understanding of what's motivating, what's driving behavior. So we'll start with this need for holistic market research and a little bit of background on the challenge. The problem that we see is that those of you on the client side and those of you on the research side or the partner side, the vendor side, are seeing an onslaught of research tools for examining emotions. And we're partly to blame for that as well. Martech certainly has our emotion intelligence techniques, some of which we'll talk about today. The question is, how do you combine these tools with the existing metrics and data? And we think that's really where the value is in not only understanding the emotions, but connecting them to the other pieces of knowledge that we've been researching for many years and that we have an understanding about. And so the solution is having this holistic approach. And we live in a world where, thankfully, we have artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, as we call it, NLP technologies, many technologies today that enable us to do a better job of combining emotional insights with functional metrics. Now, that said, the technology is not enough. There's more to it than that, and we'll highlight some of the things that we think are also key success factors to use with the technology element. So when you think about what holistic means and what it means for us in the market research space, I mean, holistic as a philosophy or as a spiritual thought obviously has been around for millennia. Holistic medicine has been around really for the last 30, 40 years in terms of thinking about how to treat people with holistic medicine. But holistic market research is something that is really recently come into vogue. And what we mean by it when we say that is understanding not only both sides of the brain, but leveraging both qualitative and quantitative, and also looking at emotional and rational, conscious and non-conscious motivations. And we think that by combining all of those, by coming up with the balancing act of words and numbers together, we can get to a much more complete, holistic picture of, again, what's going on inside the mind. So when you think about the human mind, the trick is that it's a neural network, and that the way we make decisions as human beings is described in this box in the lower left. This is a representation of what a neural network looks like, and artificial neural networks. And it's comprised of the inputs. So in our world, that could be prior experiences or brand impressions of something like price or service or the quality. Then there are these hidden layers, and underscore really on the word hidden on this page, because that's the trick, is how do we find the things that are hidden, such as the emotional and rational calculations that lead to the outputs, which would be buying decisions, and the representation of those buying decisions in core metrics such as CSAT or NPS. And that's where we'll ultimately go in this webinar, is talking about how to find those hidden layers and understand them better. But really the key is understanding not just that they're there, but that they overlap, that they're inherently connected. So things such as price are tied to the feeling of worth, or a billing process is tied to feelings of discomfort, and that the actionable insights really come from understanding that relationship between the emotions and the rational functional levers. So back to the title of this presentation, both sides of the brain, that's what we mean, is connecting all of these dots to come up with that holistic understanding, and really understanding how we can pull rational levers. We can manipulate price or billing process, but we know now what emotions that's tied to. And that gives us a much more powerful set of tools to use as marketers and market researchers. So how do we get at that? And so this idea of holistic research, turning this from a neural network example into a market research example, what we're looking at is the emotions such as trust or security or anger, and how those interconnect to the functions, price, quality, service, or can be product features, a lot of different things that can fall into that function box. And then core metrics like NPS, CSAT, customer effort score. All three of these combined create a more holistic understanding from a research standpoint of what's going on in the customer's mind. And the ultimate goal isn't just to combine them. The ultimate goal is that you can better predict those outcomes that we showed on the previous page. So the key is finding compatible data for all three elements. And that's part of the wrestling match in the world we live in today. Is there a lot of great techniques for doing each one of these, but few techniques that we found that really marry all three of them seamlessly, or that combine the ability to look at emotions as they correlate and relate to functions, metrics, etc. So that's where we're going to go next, and that's this idea of emotion intelligence. And when you think about emotion intelligence, this, as I said earlier, is where the growth is in our space. If you went to IIEX, or if you've gone to the recent Quirks events this year, you've certainly seen and been bombarded by people selling various techniques for how to understand emotions. It's certainly a new field in our space. The difficulty is, how do we take those emotion insights and integrate? And so that's what we believe we can help with, and what we're going to talk about how to do today. Is the secret is through framework and using some more analytical rigor to come up with a way to combine those three elements that create the holistic approach. So emotion intelligence, how do you do that? I won't spend much time on this page because the very fact that you're listening to this webinar indicates that you get this, that emotions drive our decisions. System 1 versus System 2 thinking and understanding that the majority of what's going on inside of our heads is System 1. I think part of what people get wrong about this description, though, is thinking about them as separate entities. That System 1 and System 2 are not two sides of the brain, and so our title may be a bit of a misnomer, but they're really describing one massive system. The whole thing works in an interconnected fashion, and it's far more seamless in terms of how emotions work with more rational, logical, or conscious level beliefs. But ultimately, we need to understand all of it, and emotions are the part that are the trickiest. They tend to be a little bit more difficult to locate and understand. So how do you do that? And so part of the way we think to getting to this holistic approach and having an easier way of combining all of the various elements of the customer's mind is by going to the world of language. That language provides a unique balance when it comes to understanding emotions. It's scientific, using linguistics and psychology. It's scalable because using language can be plugged into both quant or qualitative techniques. And for our purposes today, it's seamless. That's the most important S on this alliterative screen, is that it plugs into everything that we're using, or most things that we're using as marketers and market researchers, because that's the fundamental media that we work in, is language. So it makes it easier to connect the dots. It makes it easier to combine emotional insights with rational insights, and I say rational in quotation marks, such as CSAT or NPS. And so we'll look at how that's done and how language can provide seamless solutions as we move forward. So if you understand that emotions are expressed in language, in the words, then the key is, how do I find them? Because, as I said, they can be fairly elusive. That the first part is knowing an emotion when you see it, and so it's a bit like this word puzzle where it's not obviously apparent where the emotion words are. So you've got to have some techniques that first just identify emotions, and there are lots of techniques out there using lots of different sciences for doing so. But language, we feel, again, affords an opportunity to keep it simple and seamless, in that you can identify an emotion word such as mournful or appreciative or anger, and then now that I know that that's an emotion word, the next thing is knowing what to do with it. So there are two things that we use to do so. One, there's a dictionary of over 10,000 known emotion words, and growing by the day. It's customized to meet cultural or geographic or even markets. And that's what helps us identify whether something somebody is saying is an emotion word. And then there are patented algorithms that help organize and map those words into a simple framework. And that framework is what provides some of the analytical rigor and the ability to connect the dots back to the more quote unquote rational metrics and drivers. So when you look at that analytical framework in a little bit more detail, its basis is really these emotion channels that were developed by Robert Plutchik many decades ago, and really are a foundation in behavioral economics and many other fields. And our framework picks up on these same emotion channels, and each channel represents a type of emotion. And why that's important is because now you have an ability to map thousands of emotions into more palatable and digestible channels. And each one of these channels is representative of a combination of channel properties. And there are 4 properties that define each one of 32 different channels. And I'll show you the 32 channels here coming up. But before we do that, let's just talk about what defines them. So on the left, you see enjoyment, whether something's pleasant or unpleasant. And that's obvious. Anything emotional, anybody doing anything emotional is going to have that level. Understanding unpleasant versus pleasant, positive versus negative. It's core of all sentiment analysis, etc. But that's a good starting point, but not where you should finish when you're evaluating what type of emotion you have on your hands. The next level is interest, whether something is inward or outward. And so going back to the fact that these tools are based in psychology, it's a bit like putting a respondent on the couch and putting them through psychotherapy. It's learning how to be better listeners and understanding whether my customers are having feelings that are inward, or are they feeling things about themselves, or are the feelings that are predominant about me or my product or something that's outside, something that's outward. That's very important in terms of how you resonate when you communicate. So a therapist, when talking to a patient, if they know that they've got inward emotions, is going to respond in kind and use communications that talk about the person rather than talking about something outside of the person. Commitment, the one second from the right, that also is important in terms of understanding whether an emotion is passive or active. Some emotions are like feeling that you just want to spend the day on the beach, or you just want to be the passenger in the car gazing at the scenery as it goes by. Some emotions are much more active and drive engagement and make you feel like you want to do something. So I think from a business standpoint and as marketers, we can all see the importance of understanding whether somebody wants to take action or not. Certain emotions are more active than others. It's important to understand that. And then passion level is really an intensity measure. Some emotions are stronger than others, and understanding that, as we'll see in one of the examples coming up, can be key in terms of how to motivate your customers, how to motivate people into the behaviors that you'd like to see them take. And fundamentally, the most important thing is how to communicate. All of this boils down at the end of the day to using language as an input, but also how to use language as an output, and how to do a better job of communicating by understanding and being in harmony with the feelings that the respondent or the customer is feeling. So when you take those 32 channels, we can boil those down based on those properties into 8 channel groups. So we've shown all 8 here, starting with loyalty, amazement, joy is the one that's highlighted, serenity, and each one of these groups, these 8 groups, represents 4 channels, and each one of those channels are the same in terms of the properties. So when you look at the joy row there, this represents all the emotion channels. Of the 32 emotion channels, there are 4 channels that are all pleasant, inward, and active. And from lowest intensity to highest intensity in terms of passion level, they are energy, confidence, pride, and joy, as you read that third column from left to right. So and we'll see in one of the examples that joy as an emotion, driving up to higher levels of joy, can have a direct correlation to customer engagement because it's an active emotion. So we'll talk more about that specific emotion, but these 8 groups, again, we're simplifying and making it easier to digest and really understand what emotions you have on your hands and what to do with them. And it has less to do with the actual words and more to do with the properties, whether it's inward, outward, active, passive, pleasant, unpleasant, etc. So what that manifests into is an emotion landscape, where we then take a look at how each one of those channels, how many of the emotions that we're identifying map into each channel. And so this mirrored histogram can tell us a lot about a topic, whether that's a brand, an experience, what have you. And we look at both conscious level, that's the gray bars. Those are the feelings that people have that are above the surface. They're articulated emotions. But we can also look at non-conscious, unarticulated emotions, things that we have to dig deeper to get at. And those are the gold bars beneath the surface. And by looking at both the conscious and the non-conscious across these channels and across these properties, we can understand what to do. And that's where we'll dive into next, is what kinds of insights can you gather by putting some of the data that you have or collecting data that can be mapped into this emotion landscape. The last thing I want to talk about in the emotion intelligence overview is this new metric that Martex created, and it's called the Net Emotion Score. And we really think that this is the connective tissue for the holistic approach. The Net Emotion Score is a quantifiable, quantitative metric, a numerical metric that's derived from qualitative data. So using words, we're able to come up with a number. And so again, this balance, or this both sides of the brain, where the Net Emotion Score is one of the pivot points of that, because it takes into account whether the emotions are pleasant and unpleasant. So in this red box, you see the equation for the Net Emotion Score in a crude fashion. It takes pleasant and unpleasant feelings and accounts for that. It takes into account whether the feelings are conscious and non-conscious, and it overweights non-conscious feelings because that's where more of the activity is. And it takes into account the passion level for the emotions that we're finding. And out of that, we get a number that's between -100 and 100. So any of you using Net Promoter Score, that's going to feel very familiar. And in fact, that's one of the key ways that we use it, is combining Net Emotion Score versus Net Promoter Score. So this chart to the right is an example of how we looked at a number of leading brands, and we continue to add to this chart by comparing the Net Emotion Score to the Net Promoter Score. And we think it's a better way of looking at brand loyalty or brand strength, because it's combining what we would consider to be more of a rational metric, Net Promoter Score, which would really be a measure of an output, somebody's buying decision and whether they would recommend you, along with their emotional connection to the brand. That'd be their Net Emotion Score. And so you see that there's a strong correlation. One, we have a good trend line, but we also have some important outliers. We have Southwest, Subway, McDonald's. We have a few brands that are kind of drifting left or right off of that line, and that's where the juice is in terms of really getting something interesting to talk about and use as a brand. And one of the examples we'll show coming up is going to talk directly about what those gaps mean and how you can better understand what to do from a holistic standpoint. So that's a primer on the emotion intelligence that will help as we get into some of these case studies and start looking at some of the results. So the first example we have is a study that was done in the subscription box market, a relatively new market these days, but one that has a lot of interesting players and a lot of interesting activity. And this one was based on some inbound data that our client had. The theme we're going to talk about is mostly about joy and what to do with feelings of joy, and the output of communications, how they could communicate better. So what we did was we analyzed initial posts from a community of subscribers. Our client wanted to understand, when one of their subscribers joined their online community, what are they talking about? What are the posts about? So that was more of a rational assessment of just getting out onto the table, what are the topics? But then once we identify those topics, well, what are the emotions attached to the topics? So we started by using some augmented intelligence, and you've probably heard that term before. It's simply AI, the machine, plus some human beings. So we use Google Cloud's NLP along with our analytics team to look at the posts and extract entities or topics, and then merge those topics into some relevant and meaningful combinations. And so you see these word clouds, and it's pretty obvious the word box in both of them is popping out, and no surprise there that box was the #1 topic. So what are they talking about when they first post? They're talking about the box that is coming their way. There's no surprise there. Recognize that when we do that, there are 42 different entities that were grouped up into that one topic. So we have an ability to unpack that. And in fact, that's one of the areas we're heading, is to unpack these kinds of topical summaries. And you see just the potential topics that we had for emotional investigation. So in terms of a holistic approach, we're looking at what are they talking about, what's on their mind from a rational perspective, And then we're choosing where do we want to dive deeper to understand the emotions attached to it. In this case, we went after the box and said, well, what are the emotion words in the box post? So when somebody's talking about getting their box, what is it that they're talking about from an emotion standpoint? And that's the word cloud on the right, the emotion words that are associated with the box. And you see a couple of words more prominent than the others, excited and then love. And so let's talk about what that means from this framework that we talked about and described a little earlier. So what we do is we map all of those emotion words that we saw in that word cloud into those channels. And that starts to put the pieces together. And so we can look at where those words excited and love map. Excited maps into the energy channel. That's the big tall gray bar there, sort of in the middle of the page. And most of the emotions, 67% of the emotions we found mapped into this joy group. So most of what people are feeling are inward and active, pleasant emotions. They're also feeling a fair amount of loyalty or kindness. That's where the word love maps to, and some amazement, which is good. You don't see that in a lot of business settings. It's more experiential. So that tells us something about this box market. But when you look at that primary emotion, joy, in a little bit more detail, the key is focusing on these properties again. So we see again this word excited. We see some of the comments that what people are talking about, and we start to understand that it's a pleasant, inward, and active emotion. What are they excited about? They're excited to get their box. So they're excited about an experience that they anticipate having. And so understanding that is important, and understanding that excitement maps to a fairly low passion level is important. And so I think this is one of the insights is you could look at and say, well, that's great. I'm getting excitement around my experience and my product, but we would say not so fast. That excitement is often temporary. It lacks some internalization and doesn't have the long-term connection. You'd rather see people moving up into confidence, pride, and joy. So that then becomes more of a customer journey question in terms of, okay, if they're excited upon their first post, how do they feel on their 12th post? And so that's an important question our clients embarking upon, is looking at that full customer journey and seeing, are we moving people to higher passion levels? Because excitement, quite frankly, isn't good enough. It's good, but not good enough. So some of the key takeaways from this example, and this is one of the basic examples, the ones we'll look at next get a little bit more granular, is simply that if you look at these excitement feelings, there's opportunity there. That one, we can align what the excitement is about more explicitly. The excitement is tied to the experience of receiving something, and the love emotion is tied to the contents and products. So what that tells you how to do is how to communicate. That when you communicate with these subscribers, when you're talking about the experience, to use language that resonates with those types of emotions. Again, excitement is more of an inward emotion versus love, which is more of an outward emotion. So the way that you communicate about the box should be different than the way you communicate about the act of receiving it. And that fine-tuning of the communications can matter. Same thing with the unpleasant emotions. There weren't a lot of them we found. They had to do with confusion. So we can align the emotion with the more practical, rational side of the communications process around the initial orders and the information that's provided to subscribers. And then the opportunities are around driving greater action, using pent-up word of mouth, taking advantage of some of that excitement and energy that these customers have, and then monitoring for any problem subscribers, such as these ones where we saw some unpleasant emotions, and overall just trying to move to higher passion levels, understanding that what's driving that feeling of joy, and then correlating that joy feeling to the desired behaviors. Am I seeing the emotion relate to the behavior that I want, such as subsequent posts, and more importantly, longer-term subscriptions? The second example we'll talk about is a B2B example, and so this, we didn't want to exclude our B2B clients and friends, and wanted to make clear that it's absolutely possible to have this holistic approach in a B2B space as well as it is in B2C or consumer packaged goods. And this example was in the energy market. It was a client that is using a pretty thorough NPS tracking survey. And the notions of serenity, the feelings of serenity are important here, and we're going to talk about those. And the core question was how to move the needle. Because they're using this NPS format and platform, understanding how do you move somebody from a passive to a promoter? How do we get somebody from 7s and 8s up to 9s and 10s? How do they feel about being our customer, and how can we move them using those emotions? So again, similar kind of framework. We looked at the emotion words about how do you feel about being a customer and why. So getting as much language out on the table as possible. And most of what we saw then mapped to the serenity group. Now, serenity is kind of a kissing cousin to joy in that it's pleasant and inward. The primary difference between joy and serenity is serenity's passive. Again, think about those pictures, sitting on the beach versus driving on the beach. And so serenity is the feelings of satisfaction and comfort and being worry-free. And we often see this in baseline levels. So all the leaders in most industries have high levels of serenity. It's a table stake, and it's also associated strongly with commodity markets. And so when you look at feelings of serenity, what you can do with that is understand how to align better to what's driving our NPS, and which, back to that core question, what can we do to improve and move people from passives to promoters? And so when we looked at connecting those dots, we looked at, well, let's tie those emotions back to the NPS scores. So here's an example of a holistic perspective, understanding how NPS and emotions play together. At first blush, you see that the serenity levels there are pretty similar for both promoters and passives. So it's not really telling me anything yet. It's not giving me that separation. It's not, I can't see clearly which emotion separates the passives from promoters. I don't know where to go next just yet. What we see is the discomfort is fairly high, which makes sense for detractors. But you can also see that detractors also have some pleasant emotions. So there are inherent levels of serenity, joy, and even some loyalty amongst detractors. So those people aren't lost causes yet either. But we needed to go a little bit deeper to really get to something that was more of a customized NPS for our client. And by separating out the scores and looking at their likelihood to recommend ratings by these emotions, now some things came into focus. So for our client, the point of separation really isn't between 8 and 9. It's more about being a 7 or an 8, and that the serenity levels drop fairly significantly from that 8 to a 7. So that starts us to zero in on, okay, what is it about 7s versus 8s and serenity? Why are we not generating serenity at those levels? And it also assists in maybe there's a better way to define your NPS score, and maybe you go off the grid a little bit and have a customized paradigm versus just adopting the 9s and 10s versus the 7s and 8s. It would be a more meaningful score in this case. So where we went next is we did some qualitative mining, which is a new technique that we've developed called Q-Square Insights, and it's a technique that, again, combines quantitative and qualitative, a more holistic picture of what's going on. And what we're doing is we're looking at all of the open-ended responses in a survey. So anybody who answers the question, reason why they would recommend or not, what the rating was, and then why they said that, why they said a rating behind a channel partner rating, or any of the open-ended feedback that they gave. And using the same kinds of technology that we used in earlier examples, we can look at, well, what are the topics associated with each one of those questions, and align those questions and see that for when you talk about reason for likelihood to recommend score, the yellow bar, which is pricing and contracts, pops, versus the reason for choosing an emotion word, saying how they feel about something, was more about customer service. So customer service is more of the people. It's more of an emotional attribute versus pricing and contracts is much more about why they might recommend you. The next step is how to tie that all back to emotions and get back to this holistic perspective. So when we look at those functional topics, customer service, pricing and contracts, and billing process, what we see is that, well, while billing process wasn't all that prominent, if we go back a page, this blue bar, we don't see a lot of blue as much as we see the other colors, the gold and the teal. But if you look at on this next page, where are we seeing most of the discomfort and contempt? It's in that light gray, that's the billing process bar. So billing process, although not being talked about as much, is an active pain point. Discomfort is a very active, unpleasant emotion versus customer service is driving most of the serenity. So back to our core question of how do I move people? Well, customer service is going to be key because that's what gets the table stakes of serenity high. And then if you get to that table stake of serenity, what evokes joy is about the pricing and contracts. And so having an understanding of how these customer or these emotions and these more functional topics relate is now giving the key to what to do. The last step we took is to understand net emotion score across these key performance indicators. So we looked at the 0s and 6s, 7s through 8s, 9s and 10s based upon this net emotion score. So how does net emotion score behave depending upon how somebody rates us in the survey? You see a pretty good correlation on things like likelihood to recommend, satisfaction with the sales rep is the red, satisfaction with the problem resolution is the dark, is the black, and two that aren't as correlated. So likelihood to renew and satisfaction with channel partner relationship. So in this market, those two don't have as much emotional valence as do some of these other metrics. So maybe there's something else going on, and in fact there was, that in this kind of a B2B environment, likelihood to renew might be a group decision, not an individual decision, and satisfaction with the channel partner, again, might be something that's out of their control. So it enables us to say, well, those metrics are good, but let's zero in on a few that are probably more meaningful for you. And when we, again, unpack this and look at it from a more granular perspective, what we see is that the one that really shows the most dramatic slope for the net emotion score, what's driving up net emotion score is the satisfaction with the sales rep. So when you talk about moving somebody from a 7 to an 8 or an 8 to a 9, the red line, the satisfaction with the sales rep, the human touch, is what's really moving the needle. The satisfaction with the channel partnership and problem resolution, really there's not much difference between a 7 and an 8. They both have emotional value already. They both have high net emotion scores, which we equate to the fact that in some respects, just problem resolution in this market is about effort, and so correlates to the CES data. If you just make the effort, you're already going to score emotional points with me. So you don't get as much bang for your buck as you will by focusing on satisfaction with the sales rep. So the key takeaways from this study were understanding that those functional metrics evoke very specific emotions and aligning those emotions to those functional metrics, that the answer to how to move passives to promoters lies in satisfaction with the sales reps and how to evoke the right emotions around those sales reps. And the deeper analysis will answer that now the next step is to get to the emotions associated specifically with their sales rep, and how do we do a better job communicating and connecting to customers with our sales reps, and how do we better align the emotions with the firmographic and behavioral data for customers that rate a 7 versus an 8. So diving in more deeply into that segmentation scheme using the net emotion score. So the last example, which is a short one, was just want to highlight a few more analytics here. There won't be as long of a case study as in the cookware market. It was more of a brand image survey, more about how do we differentiate our brand emotionally using product claims. This was a global study, 14 countries, and looking at what is the emotional profile by brand, by country, and how can we leverage specific emotions tied to specific claims. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that one of the first things we did was just look at that same kind of positioning chart, net emotion score versus net promoter score for a bunch of brands. And the brands that we were most interested in, brand A and brand B, what you'll notice is in terms of the north-south net promoter score, they're pretty close to each other. The net promoter scores aren't all that different, but there's a fairly good gap between them on net emotion score. Brand A is further to the right than brand B, which indicates that brand B is not as strongly connected emotionally with its customers. So how do they close that gap? How does brand B move to the right and thereby strengthen its brand position by understanding and leveraging the emotions better? The key to that is tying it back to functional metrics and product claims. And so we have a 4-box analysis here that looks at something's emotional importance on the Y versus satisfaction levels on the X. And it helps to identify all of these may be important from a satisfaction and a traditional importance perspective. But when we look at what drives emotions and what's emotionally important, some unique things pop. And chemical resistance, temperature resistance, these become more important as the key claims to focus on in terms of how to enhance the brand position over time. Enhancing cooking performance is an area that's high importance, fairly good satisfaction, but could also move to that upper right. Basically, anything moving to the upper right is where you want to go. Start with those attributes and claims that are high on the emotional importance scale and try to move your satisfaction levels up to beat competition. So that's what we had for you guys this afternoon. I think we hope that this is at least begged some questions and got you thinking about how to connect the dots, how to use emotions as that connective tissue to better understand what's going on in your customers' minds, how to balance and use not only rational and emotional aspects, but qualitative and quantitative words and numbers to really get a holistic understanding of what's going on inside the customer's brain. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Joe and entertain any questions that we might have.
All right. I had a question. How does this compare, or this approach, I guess, compare to sentiment analysis, something like that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the page that we showed on the properties that sentiment analysis, most of the sentiment analysis that we're familiar with and have used as a research company is one-dimensional and only looks really at enjoyment levels or whether something's positive, negative, or neutral. And that if you do that, that's good, but that you're missing a big chunk of what's going on emotionally because you're not gathering that inward-outward, you're not gathering that active, passive, or those passion levels. And then I think the other thing sentiment analysis doesn't do, at least most of it that we're aware of, it doesn't create this unifying metric that enables you to connect the dots back to other numerical data like NPS, CSAT, et cetera. So it's similar, but we would consider part of our techniques to be multidimensional sentiment analysis. But I would also say that that's just one piece of this, is using existing text. There's also a science to this of just going out and doing primary research that gets at discovering net new language and emotions rather than always just applying some kind of text analytics or sentiment analysis.
Sure. I assume this is going to be sort of the secret sauce type thing, but can you explain a little bit how you calculate the net emotion score?
Yeah, it is the secret sauce, but the basics of it are we look at each individual and the words that they're providing on a topic. And so the net emotion score is calculated by weightings that are applied to, well, how much of what somebody's feeling is unpleasant versus pleasant, how much of what they're feeling is at a conscious level versus a non-conscious level, and overweighting the non-conscious emotions over the conscious emotions. And then whether the emotions that they're feeling are, how strong are they? So back to our excitement example, are they feeling excitement, which is low passion level, or are they feeling joy, that would be a high passion level? Same type of emotion, but just higher passion level. So feelings of joy would contribute to a higher net emotion score than feelings of excitement, as an example. So those are the basic variables in the equation. Yeah, we can't really share the exact equation.
Sure.
But I would say it can be applied and it's a customizable, there's a core version. We have light versions, if you will, that we use. For example, when we can't get a non-conscious because of research limitations, if we can only look at conscious emotions, we can still create a conscious level net emotion score to apply back to functional or other rational data points.
Sure. I had a couple questions too, just about, I think, the methodology for gathering, for the questioning, and for how to gather the information. Is it done through open-ended type questions, or what are some of the question types or the questioning of the respondents to get the information you're looking for?
Yeah, it's a mix. So it's it's primarily open-end because we're dealing in language. So the more language we have to work with, the better off we are. So if it's a primary research or we're plugging into a survey. So the example I showed was actually something where we plugged in a battery of questions to an existing survey, and the questions that were plugged in were pretty evenly split between open ends and some scaling questions. And the scaling questions help us get at that passion level and the intensities somebody's feeling. It also helps us to establish some baseline emotions. One of the things you have to do in this type of research is understand what somebody's baseline emotions are, be that across a wide time horizon. So are you naturally a happy person, or are you naturally an unhappy person? That has something to do with whether our brand or our product is evoking happiness. Obviously, if you're naturally happy, you're already there. So we ask some questions that are quantitative in nature to get at those baseline emotions and how you feel that day. The day of the research can matter. If somebody ran over your puppy that morning, we need to understand that in our research. So it's a mixed bag. Again, we're trying to have a balanced approach here, combining the quant and the qual. I would say the overarching thing is that it's fairly non-invasive, or can be fairly non-invasive. It can also be pretty in-depth, tying into ethnographic, customer journey mapping kinds of exercises, and get pretty thorough. So sure. It's a bit of both.
I had a couple questions too about just talking about the cost and timing implications of using these types of tools versus traditional techniques.
Yeah, the timing and cost is pretty similar to traditional techniques. So again, because these are non-invasive techniques, we're trying to have these be easy to use, seamless plugins, and even if it is a standalone study, to be in a bandwidth of costs that are going to feel familiar to people in the research space. And so, the fieldwork costs are going to be pretty similar to what people experience today, whether it be qual or quant. The analytics piece is going to be a little bit more than what you might be spending just to get a traditional analysis, but not a lot. So I would say, because there's a learning curve with emotions, there's a cost associated with that, and it's mostly on the front end and the back end, and some of the socializing of the results, and helping senior management teams and other people to understand not only the framework, but also the so what's, the implications, and how to, again, connect those dots. How do we use language on the back end? Here's a thesaurus of emotional keywords, for example. How do you go use that in copywriting or other messaging, or et cetera? So the costs are going to feel in a familiar bandwidth, I guess, is the best answer.
Sure. Mm-hmm. I had a couple questions along these lines too, about how you identify, I guess, conscious versus non-conscious emotions, based on the information that you're getting from the respondents.
Yeah. So that's a great question. One of the keys for when we have two fundamental techniques. One we call emotion detecting. Emotion detecting looks at existing text. It's more of the multidimensional sentiment analysis. And so if we're using that to look at community posts or data scraped from a website or inbound customer service streams or past research, we can only get to a conscious level emotion by looking at existing language. To get to the non-conscious, we do have to deploy a few exercises, a few questions in whatever research methodology is being used. Again, can be qual, can be quant, but to get to the non-conscious, there are a few questions that we have to ask, exercises we have to run. And crudely, how they work is, back to the example I said, if we need to understand whether somebody's baseline level of emotions, what that is, and by understanding their baseline emotion, we can run calculations, and this is part of the patented science as to what is happening at a deeper level, what's happening more in the non-conscious, and therefore is rising to the surface. And the way that that's done, crudely again, is by understanding if something is off baseline or on baseline. So if something makes you feel an emotion that is not a normal, quote unquote, emotion for you, then we equate that to having a deeper layer, to being deeper in your non-conscious and rising to the surface. So that, hopefully that makes sense. That's a topic that probably is worthy of more in-depth conversation, white papers, et cetera. So
right. I had a question here too that's perhaps more philosophical, but just asking about, do you prefer to use quant or qual to get these types of responses from respondents? And then if quant is used, what you do to overcome the limits or the caveats related to using quant?
Yeah, I'd say it's both. I'm sorry to give that answer, but
right.
If it's quant, typically we find that the amount of language is less per record, right? So I think that's one of the things we're also working with clients on, is how to strengthen the open-ended responses that you get, how to ask questions in a different manner versus the same old open-end, please tell me why stuff. But even with these enhanced lines of questioning, you still don't get as many words, as much language in a survey as you will in ethnographic or online qual or in-person qual. And so, two different beasts, but both work. And so what comes into play is sample size. So if we have a quant study where you've got, for example, that NPS example we showed was a quantitative survey, we'd want a higher sample size, right? 300, 400, 500,000 records, et cetera. The more the merrier, so that we have more language and we can use the law of large numbers to come up with results that are credible. So, and so we would want that quantitative data along with that qualitative open end in those surveys so that we can run the correlations and compute our NES and tie it back to your quantitative data. On qualitative data, we've done techniques using 10 IDIs with cardiologists, but each IDI was 90 minutes and just fraught with emotional language. And so it really depends upon the nature of what you're doing. Not every study is ideal for these emotion intelligence techniques and for coming up with a holistic approach, but we can find ways to work with both qual and quant. It usually boils down to the size of the sample and the amount of language we have per record.
Sure. Okay. How about the question here too? Why do you consider metrics such as NPS and CSAT to be rational versus emotional in nature?
Yeah, good question. I think that's we don't consider them to be purely rational, but we consider them to be more rational. And it goes back to that word hidden, that anytime somebody's answering a question about how satisfied they are or whether they would recommend you, there are, of course, emotional aspects in that answer or in that decision as per the system 1, system 2 argument. So the emotions are in there. The problem with those numerical ratings and scores is that it's hidden. And so when we say that they're rational, it's more because they're displaying a rational answer, but we've got to go get the emotional associations out of it. And that's where we use the language. That's where we use these techniques to augment something like NPS and turn it into more of a balanced, holistic metric. So It's not that they're purely rational. It's just that in the state they're in today, they're more rational, and we kind of need to turn the light on so that they can become more full-bodied, if you will.
Sure. So probably be the last one here. Do you have any concrete or specific examples, or some other examples other than the ones that you cited, of what clients have done once they've gotten the valuable learning?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there are a couple of different ways that people put this to use. I mean, because it's language, it easily pours into all things creative, copywriting, et cetera. So we're definitely helping clients to refine their language to be in greater harmony with their customers. And so everything from ad copy to claims and message testing to flipboards, et cetera, you name it. Anywhere where language is going out the other side to communicate with customers is a key area that these tools are being used to just, if you think about it again in that therapy analogy, how a doctor, how a clinical psychologist talks to his or her patient is what we're trying to replicate, and just have a greater resonance between the two. Be a better listener on the input side, be a better communicator on the output side. But we've got clients who've used it for innovation, to break the tie, to look at, I've got product concepts that have all scored well on a rational scorecard. I need an emotional scorecard to break the tie because I can't decide which product really is the winner. We do a lot of segmentation work to help refine and add emotions to the needs-based framework or to whatever framework people are using. And again, just sort of having a more holistic approach. But I'd say, anything brand tracker, anything communications, copywriting, and then scorecards and segmentation. Those would probably be four of the big ones. I'm sure I'm leaving some things out, but if anybody's interested, let me know. We have a lot more case studies we can share and more explicit examples we can give of what people are doing, obviously within reason, but we can share redacted examples of how people are putting these results to use.
Sure. Well, yeah, we are almost at the top of the hour here, so I think that's about all we have time for today. But I'd like to thank Chuck and everyone at Martech, and also thank all of you most importantly, for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. And thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day.